This video is created for entertainment purposes only. I sincerely respect all BTS members. This content is purely fictional and based on imagination. If this is not your interest, please feel free to skip the video. Please do not repost or re-edit my story. All background images and songs used in this video belong to their respective owners. All credits go to them. Hello KJ, this is a sad story, but it is purely imaginary. I do not have a single negative thought about JK's health or life. Everything here is created only for my story character. All the situations and scenes mentioned are part of my imagination. I sincerely wish and hope the best for everyone. Warning: if you are soft-hearted or uncomfortable with sad stories, you may skip this video. I sincerely apologize if this story made anyone feel sad. Please forgive my grammatical mistakes. Note: this video is based on my limited knowledge and research about the disease. I am not a medical professional, so if there are any mistakes, I sincerely apologize and kindly request you to correct them in the comments section.
The stadium, night. The arena was no longer just a venue. It was the heart of a global phenomenon. Beyond the walls of the stadium, the event surged through the veins of the digital world, tethering millions of people together in a single, breathless moment. From the roaring crowds in the stands to the silent watchers, in distant cities staring at glowing screens, the entire world seemed to lean in. It was a sea of humanity stretching across continents, a global constellation of fans waiting for a moment years in the making. The air didn't just hum, it vibrated with a historical electricity that transcended physical space. Tonight wasn't just a concert, it was a revelation shared by millions. A heavy, expectant silence dropped like a curtain. At the center of the obsidian stage, a single, piercing spotlight cut through the dark, carving out a perfect circle of white light. He stepped into the glow. The breath went out of the stadium. On the towering LED screens, the camera caught him in a sharp, crystalline focus. He was ethereal, a striking juxtaposition of soft innocence and sharp, masculine charm. A face that had been a mystery was now a masterpiece revealed to the world. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of indrawn breaths. Then the explosion. The name didn't just echo. It vibrated through the floorboards. A roar of disbelief and adoration. Clad in head-to-toe black, he looked like a shadow carved from the night itself. He didn't speak. Instead, he offered a deep, slow bow of profound respect, his lips curling into a smile so gentle it felt like a secret shared with everyone at once. Then, he slowly started his song. His voice emerged as a haunting, a cappella thread. Stripping the grand anthem down to its raw, emotional nerves. It was slow, deliberate, and intimate, as if he were whispering a secret to every one of the millions watching. Slowly, the cinematic percussion began to build, a low thrumming like a distant heartbeat. With every line, the tempo swelled, the energy rising until the full, triumphant production of Dreamers exploded through the speakers. He was no longer just a singer. He was the conductor of a global pulse. But as the rhythm reached its peak, the strain began to show. The contrast was harrowing. The music was soaring, powerful, and relentless, while his own strength was visibly flickering like a candle in a gale. He fought to stay upright, his voice remaining pitch-perfect even as his body betrayed him. Then, the world went tilt. Amidst the thundering drums and the soaring synths, he plummeted. The sudden silence of his voice against the loud, driving track made the collapse feel like a physical blow to everyone watching. The air in the room was a suffocating shroud, brittle with the chill of a dying fire. He bolted upright. The transition from sleep to reality, a violent collision. His body wasn't just shaking. It was vibrating with a primal, rhythmic terror. Every breath was a jagged shard of glass pulled through his throat, shallow, uneven, and desperate. He pressed a trembling hand against his chest, trying to keep his heart from hammering its way out of his ribs. Then the pressure shifted. It wasn't just a lack of air anymore. It was an invasion. A cough tore from his lungs, a wet, splintering sound that seemed to crack the very silence of the room. He clamped his hand over his mouth, his shoulders heaving as the fit turned rhythmic and cruel. Each spasm felt like a rusted blade turning in his chest. And then the metallic sting hit his tongue, the unmistakable, cold taste of iron. He pulled his hand away slowly, his eyes widening. In the pale moonlight filtering through the slats, his palm was slick and glistening with a dark, visceral crimson. He stared at it for a heartbeat too long, the reality of his own mortality leaking through his fingers. Driven by a panicked instinct to hide the evidence of his decay, he stumbled toward the washroom. The porcelain basin felt like ice under his touch. He didn't just cough now, he convulsed. A torrent of crimson splattered against the white ceramic, his inner agony finally finding a physical form. It was as if his very soul was trying to exit, his body in a red tide. The world began to fray at the edges. The sharp lines of the room dissolved into a gray, watery haze. His knees buckled, hitting the floor with a dull thud that he felt rather than heard as he slumped against the cold tile. The only thing left of the world was the hollow, rhythmic drip hiss of the leaking tap, echoing in the cavern of his skull like a funeral march. His eyelids grew heavy, a strange, sedating peace washing over the pain. "Let it be tonight," he whispered into the void of his mind. "Let this be the end of the war." Then the atmosphere itself seemed to fracture. Out of the thin air, the darkness curdled and took shape. A towering, ink-black silhouette manifesting from the void. It stood over his broken form, a silent, predatory eclipse. It didn't move, it simply watched, its gaze a cold weight as it bore witness to his fading pulse. The air in the hospital cabin was thick, smelling of antiseptic and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The only sound was the rhythmic, indifferent snick, snick, snick of the wall clock, counting down time that no one in the room felt they had left. The doctor didn't speak immediately. He closed the medical file with a slow, deliberate finality, the sound of the cardboard hitting the desk echoing like a gavel. He adjusted his glasses, but he didn't look at the charts. He looked at the two men, his eyes heavy with the burden of the news he was about to deliver. "Doctor," voice low, vibrating with a practiced, painful empathy. "His body is shutting down. We've reached the point where medicine is no longer a cure, but a witness. Anything can happen now." He leaned in, the fluorescent lights reflecting off his lenses. "Doctor, he's losing ground every hour. We need to move him to the ICU immediately, not for recovery, but for stabilization." The silence that followed was deafening. Jimin felt the world tilt. Beside him, Yoongi didn't move, but his shadow seemed to flicker. Under the desk, hidden from the doctor's sight, Yoongi's hand found Jimin's. His grip wasn't just a gesture, it was an anchor, his fingers digging into Jimin's palm, as if to keep him from drifting away into the floor. "Yoongi," voice like dry glass, nearly cracking. "Are you telling us to stop hoping?" The doctor didn't look up. He simply lowered his head, his silence a heavy, suffocating shroud. "Doctor," a breathy whisper. "I'm sorry." Jimin's breath hitched, a sharp, jagged sound. His lips trembled, searching for a question. He was too terrified to ask. Yoongi's jaw turned to stone. He stared at a scratch on the doctor's desk, his eyes burning with a silent, ferocious war against his own tears. He swallowed the lump in his throat. It felt like swallowing shards of ice. "Yoongi," softly, with a terrifying calmness. "We understand, doctor. Do what you have to do. We'll be ready." The corridor was a tunnel of blinding, surgical white. The overhead lights hummed, a low, electric drone that grated on the nerves. Jimin was slumped on a chair, his spine curved, as if he were carrying the weight of the entire building. His fingers were white-knuckled, laced so tightly together it looked painful. He wasn't crying yet. He was vibrating with the effort of holding. The scream inside. His eyes weren't just red, they were raw. The skin around them bruised from the exhaustion of that one day, and the salt of unshed tears. Yoongi appeared from the shadows of the hallway. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't say, "It will be fine." He simply sat, his shoulder pressing against Jimin's, offering the only thing he had, his presence. He pressed a cold bottle of juice into Jimin's hand. "Yoongi," a rough murmur, "drink. If you collapse, you can't stay with him. Don't let him wake up in an empty room." Jimin's hands shook so violently the liquid sloshed against the plastic. He took a sip, but it tasted like ash. He leaned his head back against the cold wall, his throat working hard to keep the sobs down. Yoongi watched him, his heart breaking in a way he couldn't hide anymore. The stoic mask was slipping. "Yoongi," gently, his voice is trembling now. "It's okay to let go, Jimin. You're fighting a war that's already over. Don't be stubborn. Let him see you, not your grief." That was the breaking point. Jimin's head snapped toward Yoongi, his expression a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. The dam broke. Yoongi didn't wait. He lunged forward, pulling Jimin into him, tucking Jimin's head into the crook of his neck. The moment Jimin's face hit Yoongi's shoulder, a haunting, broken sob tore out of him. It was the sound of a heart finally giving up. Jimin's fingers bunched into the fabric of Yoongi's coat, clinging to him like a drowning man. "Jimin," muffled, voice hitching in agony. I can't watch him fade away. I can't see him like this anymore. Yoongi." Yoongi squeezed his eyes shut, a single, stray tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. He pulled Jimin tighter, his hand rhythmically, desperately patting Jimin's back. "Yoongi," a broken whisper. "Aish." I know. He held him there, two broken people in a bright, cold hallway, clinging to each other, as if they were the only two souls left in a crumbling world. The inside of the ICU was drowned in a sterile silence, broken only by the faint rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor. Under the pale hospital lights, Jungkook lay motionless. He looked frighteningly fragile, his skin ghostly pale, his cheeks hollow, and his veins visible. Beneath the thin layer of skin stretched over his exhausted frame, an 4-needle pierced the back of his trembling hand, while an oxygen mask covered the lower half of his face. Each breath was shallow and uneven, as though the simple act of breathing had become a labor of pain. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass windows. Inside, a death-like stillness lingered. In the middle of that suffocating silence, a dark figure stood beside his bed. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't entirely a shadow either. It hovered soundlessly, watching Jungkook with unreadable eyes. It waited, watching, as if it had been there for a very long time. Then, Jungkook's fingers twitched weakly. A strained breath escaped through the oxygen mask, as his eyelids slowly fluttered open. At first, everything was a blur. The white ceiling, the flickering lights, the cold air. Then, the dark figure entered his vision. Jungkook froze. His eyes widened in horror. Fear crashed into him instantly, making his body tremble violently against the mattress. Sweat rolled down his temples as panic tightened around his chest. He tried to move, tried to scream, but his body betrayed him. No voice came out, only painful, broken gasps. The shadow watched him silently for a few seconds. Then, suddenly, the darkness dissolved. The shadow transformed into a man. No, not a man. Something far too beautiful to belong to the human world. His face was ethereal, like an angel carved from moonlight and sorrow. He had a sharp jawline, pale skin, and dark eyes colder than a winter night. He was beautiful, but terrifyingly empty. The stranger stared at JK with an unreadable expression. While JK looked back with nothing but fear and confusion, the man finally spoke. I am your soul guardian. His voice was deep and calm, yet strangely soft, like darkness wrapped in velvet. Silence filled the room again. JK's lips parted weakly. His whisper was barely audible. Your face. His breathing shook painfully. It's familiar. He tried to speak louder, though his throat burned with unbearable pain. The stranger answered calmly. I already told you. I am your soul guardian. I took the form of your soul. JK stared at him blankly. The man continued. You may call me Taeyoung. The name lingered heavily in the cold room. For several seconds, JK said nothing. Finally, he managed to ask, what do you mean, soul guardian? A soul guardian's duty is to help each person understand their own life, Taeyoung replied. A broken smile appeared on JK's lips. His eyes filled with tears and his voice cracked like shattered glass. Why did you do this to me? Taeyoung's expression did not change. I did nothing to you. A tear escaped JK's eye, sliding down his temple into the pillow. His lips trembled violently. Are you kidding me? No. Then tell me. JK's voice became sharper despite his weakness. What sin did I commit to deserve this life? Taeyoung simply stared at him. That silence hurt more than any answer. Suddenly, JK started coughing harshly. His chest tightened violently as he struggled to breathe. The monitor beeped faster. His entire body shook painfully as blood stained the edge of his lips. Within seconds, nurses and doctors rushed inside. His oxygen is dropping. Stabilize him now. Machines beeped wildly while nurses adjusted the 4 lines. Throughout the chaos, Taeyoung never moved. He stood there silently, watching, like death patiently waiting. When JK's condition finally stabilized, the room grew quiet once again. Weak and exhausted, JK slowly turned his head toward Taeyoung. His voice was hoarse and broken. So, you're not an illusion? Taeyoung shook his head. No. JK swallowed painfully. Are you? There's no need to speak aloud. Taeyoung interrupted coldly. Even your thoughts can reach me. JK's breath hitched. The day your body started showing symptoms was the day I began following you. Taeyoung said softly. And now it's time for you to see my face. JK spoke in his mind, and Taeyoung replied in kind. So nobody knows you are here? No one can see you. Taeyoung nodded in agreement. Then, JK whispered the question he feared most. So, my countdown has started? Taeyoung nodded. Yes. That single movement shattered something inside JK. Tears streamed down his face. Taeyoung did not comfort him. He did not touch him. He did not lie. He simply stood there with those cold, merciless eyes. Finally, the pain exploded. Are you ashamed of yourself? JK cried weakly. You and your God are the reason my life became this miserable. Does goodness even exist in this world? Why did you give me this life? I hate you. I hate all of you. JK turned his face away and broke down. Silent sobs wrecked his fragile body. For the first time, Taeyoung's expression softened slightly. Don't pressure yourself. I will answer all your questions. This is my duty. And no, I don't feel ashamed. We did nothing to you. Everything that happened to you began with choices. JK frowned weakly. Taeyoung looked directly into his eyes. What is your definition of God? The concept of God changes for every person. That's why everyone sees God differently. God is not simply a being sitting in the sky. Taeyoung's dark eyes deepened. Generator, organizer, destroyer. These exist inside every living creature in this universe. You created a face for God from your imagination. You searched for someone outside yourself and forgot to look within. All reactions are born from actions, and your actions are born from choices. Taeyoung's voice became colder. To be clear, you are one of the reasons you became this way. A bitter smirk appeared on JK's lips. Oh really? Then what about newborn babies? What choices did they make to suffer? Taeyoung answered immediately. It's not the child's fault. It's the parents. Everything in this universe is connected. One person's actions never affect only themselves. Good or bad, the consequences spread to others. JK's voice cracked. Then what was my fault? A long silence followed. Taeyong looked at him for several seconds before answering. Your choices. Something inside Jungkook died hearing that. He stopped crying. He stopped shaking. His face became emotionless. A hollow laugh escaped his lips. Oh, really? Yes. The ICU drowned in silence once more. Save for the heart monitor. Minutes passed before JK spoke again, his voice sounding tired and defeated. I want to know what choices. Taeyong nodded slowly, his dark eyes locking onto JK's. Close your eyes. Taeyong sighed, and JK followed that. The ash of every action still clings to the soul. Every choice leaves a scar the heart remembers long after the moment is gone. Some mistakes do not fade with time. They become ruins we quietly live inside. And the past. The past is a ghost that never stops walking beside us. The amber-lit room breathed in heavy, luxurious silence. A grand chandelier cast a warm, golden glow across the space, wrapping everything in the softness of quiet silk. On the bed lay Mrs. John. She was exhausted, yet breathtakingly beautiful. Her delicate fingers rested protectively beside. The tiny angel sleeping against her skin. The infant possessed chubby cheeks, round, boba-like eyes, and tiny pink lips. His soft feet were no bigger than a palm. He drank his milk peacefully, cradled securely in his mother's embrace. The heavy oak door slowly clicked open. Mr. John stepped into the room. Time ground to a sudden halt. Their eyes locked across the expanse, bridging 6 long months of agonizing separation. In an instant, the crushing weight of distance, the hollow ache of loneliness, and the endless, sleepless nights melted into the quiet air. Tears shimmered in their eyes. Faint, trembling smiles touched their lips. In a soft whisper, fragile as a breath, Mrs. John spoke. Why are you late, Jigia? A tiny pout of sulkiness hid beneath her overwhelming longing. Guilt weighed heavily in Mr. John's eyes as he crossed the room. Because of an emergency situation at the company. He had been forced to leave Mrs. John behind and stay in a foreign country for the growth of their business. He sat carefully on the edge of the mattress. Bending down, he gently pressed his lips against her forehead. I'm sorry, JJ. Mrs. John closed her eyes, inhaling his familiar scent. Looking down at the bundle in her arms, she whispered softly, Here's our son. Together, they turned their gaze toward the little boy. Their hearts overflowed. Carefully, almost fearfully, Mr. John slipped his large hands beneath the infant and lifted him up. Disturbed from his feeding, the tiny boy squirmed instantly. He waved his miniature hands and kicked his feet in protest. Wide, innocent eyes blinked up at the unfamiliar face that Mr. John froze. Happy tears rolled uncontrollably down his cheeks. In a cracked voice, trembling with long-suppressed emotion, he whispered to the child, Our baby, Cookie. He pressed a loving kiss onto the baby's soft forehead. The little one suddenly squeezed his eyes shut and began to cry loudly. Mr. and Mrs. John exchanged a glance before breaking into soft, breathless laughter. Give him back to me, Mrs. John said gently, though reluctant to let go. Mr. John carefully returned the baby to her chest. Almost instantly, the wailing ceased. Soon, baby JK slept peacefully against his mother's heartbeat. His parents watched his shallow breaths as though the entire universe had been placed into their palms. Mr. John gently brushed the baby's velvet hair. He whispered with fierce, quiet determination, You will be smart, intelligent. I will give you the best of everything. You will always be number one. Mrs. John looked at her husband, and they smiled. It was the innocent, blinding dream of parents who love their child more than life itself. Every parent dreams this exact dream. Not all, but surely most. They vow to give their child the world. They promise to make them the brightest, the smartest, and the undisputed number one in everything. Yet, behind those beautiful dreams hides a devastating truth. Expectations. They are silent, crushing burden wrapped tightly in the guise of love. Not every child is born to climb the exact same mountain. As the famous words often attributed to Albert Einstein warn, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Sometimes, the deepest, most permanent wounds are inflicted not by hatred, but by a love that simply expected too much. The world never made sense to little JK in words. It made sense in vibrations. While other children chased butterflies and laughed for no reason, JK would sit perfectly still beneath the old willow tree, his head tilted toward the sky. He listened. He heard the fragile rustle of dying leaves. He felt the rhythmic heartbeat of rain against the glass. He found a hidden melody trapped inside silence itself. Music flowed through him naturally, as if his soul had memorized notes long before his lips learned words. Yet, while his spirit bloomed like art, he remained an average student. And to his father, average was synonymous with failure. Worse than that, JK was growing into everything Mr. John despised. Soft, untamed, and unpredictable. Midnight wrapped the John household in a suffocating silence. Inside their bedroom, Mr. and Mrs. John sat against the wooden headboard, the crushing weight of exhaustion resting heavily on their shoulders. A dim amber lamp painted tired, distorted shadows across the room. Mr. John stared into the empty dark, lost in a cold void of thought. Mrs. John gently placed her hand on his tense shoulder. He looked at her, then released a long, fractured breath. "What are you thinking about, Jagiya?" she asked softly. Mr. John's eyes darkened, stripped of all warmth. "I think Cookie needs more attention," he said, his voice flat. His behavior, there is no discipline, no manners. He is becoming impossible to control. He demanded professional perfection from a child who was barely old enough for preschool. This toxic expectation was born from a seed planted by JK's teachers. They had spoken to his father out of pure, innocent concern, never imagining that their harmless feedback would justify such a horrific punishment. Mrs. John frowned, her heart tightening. "What do you mean?" "I think," he paused, his gaze hardening, "we should send him to a hostel." The air in the room instantly froze. There, he will learn discipline, independence, manners. His voice turned to iron. "If he stays here with us, our softness will ruin his future." "But he is just a child," Mrs. John whispered, her voice breaking as she pleaded for her boy. Mr. John cut her off instantly. "No, JJ. Discipline is the greatest quality a person can possess. The world respects perfection, not softness." A heavy, agonizing silence followed. With a trembling mind and an uneven, breaking heartbeat, Mrs. John looked away. Slowly she nodded. The dark consumed the last of her resistance. A father's love can sometimes build the most terrifying prisons. Using bricks of good intentions, Mr. John dreamed of a flawless son. So, he began to shape JK like cold iron beneath a merciless fire. Every minor mistake was met with punishment. Every small failure became a deliberate humiliation. Without realizing it, the pursuit of perfection slowly mutated into deep, quiet trauma. At an age when other children still slept holding their mother's hand, little JK was sent away. He was only a first-standard child. He was too young to understand abandonment, and far too small to carry the crushing weight of loneliness. The day he left home, he felt like a tiny bird trapped inside an iron cage. For a child, losing the touch of a parent's little finger feels exactly like drowning in the middle of a dark, boundless ocean. The hostel stood tall, gray, and completely lifeless. It was a massive fortress filled with strangers. Children laughed in the corridors, footsteps echoed endlessly, and teachers shouted sharp instructions. Yet JK felt entirely alone. The dining hall served countless dishes, but none tasted of his mother's love. The beds were soft, but they entirely lacked the warmth of his mother. The study halls were dead silent, but no father sat beside him anymore, correcting his mistakes with a pen in hand. Everything existed, yet nothing was alive. The very air felt suffocating, smelling of industrial cleaner and industrial loneliness. Every corner of the building stood as a silent witness to the weeping of abandoned children. The first stage was the fracture. It was defined by sleepless nights, skipped meals, and bitter crying muffled beneath scratchy blankets. Then came the bullying, the fear, and the dark. Tiny, bleeding scars formed on his heart, noticed by no one. Then came the second stage, the silence. It was the painful, freezing understanding that nobody was coming to save him. The hopeful spark in his large, expressive eyes slowly died out. Finally, the third stage settled deep into his bones, the armor. The child who once laughed loudly stopped speaking altogether. The mischievous boy completely disappeared. His childish innocence burned away beneath the weight of cold discipline and impossible expectations. He learned to hide his emotions, to bury his pain, and to survive silently. Little J.K. became an introvert, not because he chose to, but because loneliness had taught him its cruelest lesson. Feelings only make people weak. One rainy afternoon, when the isolation became too heavy to bear, J.K. found his way to an old, forgotten music room at the edge of the campus. In the corner sat a dusty piano. He approached it slowly, his small, trembling fingers hovering over the keys. He pressed one. A single, pure note reverberated through the empty room. J.K. closed his eyes. The rhythm of the rain outside perfectly matched the vibration in his chest. For the first time in years, the iron cage cracked open. He could not cry to his parents, and he could not speak to his teachers. But as he pressed the keys, letting the tears finally pour down his face, the music held him. In a world that demanded perfection and offered isolation, the melody became his only sanctuary, the only place where his broken soul could still breathe, wild and free. The sharp echo of applause shattered the heavy silence of the abandoned music room. Jungkook froze. His trembling fingers slipped from the piano keys, leaving the final, aching note to bleed out and die in the musty air. His chest tightened instantly. Panic crawled up his throat like cold, suffocating smoke. Someone heard him. Desperately, he wiped the hot tears from his cheeks with the rough sleeve of his school uniform. He forced his features into a mask of cold indifference, hiding every crack in his expression. In his world, sadness was a weakness he was forbidden to show. The broken glass window creaked softly. A boy stepped through the shattered frame effortlessly. Behind him, the heavy gray sky broke open, and the pale, watery light of a rainy afternoon spilled into the room, catching the mist to crown his silhouette with a soft, silver gold halo. Soft blonde hair danced under the cool light, and his smile, small, gentle, and impossibly beautiful, felt entirely surreal in a place so deeply rotten with loneliness. The stranger looked at him with sparkling eyes. There was no judgment. There was no disgust. There was only pure wonder. "Hi," the boy said softly. His voice carried the literal warmth of spring breaking through a cruel, relentless winter. "My name is Jimin." He walked closer, stretching out a hand with an innocent, open palm. "Nice to meet you." Jungkook could only stare blankly. Confusion clouded his tear-stained eyes. No one had ever approached him like this before. There was no mocking laugh. There was no sharp criticism. There were no cruel whispers pointing out his mistakes. There was only quiet kindness. When Jungkook didn't move, Jimin blinked awkwardly, a faint flush rising to his cheeks before he slowly lowered his hand. "Oh." Jimin laughed quietly, rubbing the back of his neck to ease the tension. "Sorry for disturbing you." His eyes drifted back toward the weathered piano, as the rain drummed softly against the glass outside. But that was absolutely amazing. The raw sincerity in his voice was undeniable. And that single sentence, that tiny, genuine fragment of praise, completely demolished every emotional wall. Jungkook had desperately spent years trying to hold together. His vision blurred instantly. He lowered his head, trying to shield the fresh tears threatening to spill over. Because this was the very first time anyone had ever praised his music, instead of tearing him apart for his flaws. Jimin noticed the shift immediately. The easy smile faded from his lips, replaced by an expression of deep, urgent worry. Without a second thought, he rushed forward. "Hey!" Before Jungkook could pull away or brace himself, Jimin wrapped his arms around him. Warmth. That was the first thing that pierced through Jungkook's shock. It was radiant, human warmth he had forgotten even existed in the world, contrasting sharply with the chilly dampness of the storm outside. Jungkook stiffened, his entire body locking up at the sudden impact of the embrace. But slowly, painfully, the fight drained out of him. His body finally gave in, collapsing forward as if he had at long last found a sanctuary safe enough to fall apart in. His forehead sank heavily against Jimin's shoulder, and there, in the quiet of the ruins, he wept. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob. It was the quiet, broken weeping of a soul that had been forced to stay strong for far too long. Jimin's hand began to move in slow, soothing circles across Jungkook's back, anchoring him to the present without forcing him to speak. "Aish," Jimin whispered, his voice cracking with a tenderness that held no pity, only unconditional comfort. "It's okay." He tightened the embrace slightly. "It's okay, kid. I'm here now, so you don't have to worry anymore." For the first time in his life, Jungkook actually believed those words. Minutes melted away to the rhythmic sound of rainfall. Before they finally pulled apart, Jungkook immediately cast his gaze downward, burning with embarrassment, utterly unable to meet the older boy's eyes. Jimin merely smiled, understanding the shame of vulnerability without needing a single word of explanation. He kept a gentle, grounding hand resting on Jungkook's trembling shoulder. "Hey kid." His tone was incredibly careful, as if he were trying not to scare away a wild animal. "What's your name?" A heavy, suffocating silence filled the space between them. Then, finally it broke. Jungkook. The name barely left his throat, nothing more than a fragile whisper. Yet, Jimin's face lit up, his eyes curving into brilliant crescents, as if he had just been gifted something profoundly precious. "Jungkook." Jimin repeated the syllables, letting them linger in the air. "That's a beautiful name." JK's fingers curled into his slacks. No one had ever said that to him before either. Jimin leaned back casually against the mahogany edge of the piano. "So what grade are you in?" "First year, high school." "Oh, really?" Jimin grinned, a spark of mischief returning to his eyes. "I'm a third year. That means I'm officially your senior." JK gave a single, quiet nod. The silence returned to the music room. But strangely, the suffocating loneliness was gone. Jimin glanced down at the ivory keys. "Did you study piano professionally?" JK shook his head slowly. Jimin's eyes widened in genuine shock. "What? Are you serious? But you play so beautifully." JK remained frozen, deliberately avoiding eye contact. His emotions were still far too raw, too fragile to handle the weight of another compliment. Jimin read the hesitation perfectly. Instead of pushing for answers or demanding more, he simply stayed. He stood by the piano, patient and still, like someone willing to wait for an eternity. If that was what it took. After a long moment, Jimin reached out, gently tilting JK's chin up just enough so their eyes could meet. "Look, I can tell you're hurting," Jimin murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I won't force you to talk about it." The shifting gray light flickered across his features as his bright, comforting grin returned. "When you feel ready, you can tell me everything." He paused dramatically, pointing a thumb at his own chest with playful pride. "From now on, I'll be your hyung." JK's eyes widened slightly. "Because," Jimin continued, his voice wrapping around Jungkook like a blanket, "I've always wanted a little brother just like you." Then, with an aching gentleness, he reached out and affectionately ruffled JK's messy hair. "Okay." JK stared at him in stunned silence. His chest felt incredibly strange. It was too warm, too light to the point of being almost painful. Jimin checked his watch and let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh. Class is starting. He began walking backward toward the shattered window, where the rain was beginning to slow to a drizzle. We'll meet here again tomorrow, okay? For the first time since they had met, JK looked directly into Jimin's eyes. He didn't speak. His face remained guarded and expressionless. But beneath the mask, he gave a firm, deliberate nod. That tiny micro-expression made Jimin's smile bloom wider than ever before. By Jungkook, with a final wave, Jimin slipped through the broken window, his figure instantly swallowed by the misty afternoon light. JK stood frozen beside the piano long. After the older boy had gone, he watched the empty space, waiting until even the last traces of Jimin's shadow vanished from the floorboards. Yet, looking around, the abandoned music room suddenly didn't feel quite so empty anymore. JK slowly pressed his palm against his chest. His heart was hammering wildly against his ribs, fluttering like a bird newly released from a cage. It felt as though he had just woken up from a breathtakingly beautiful dream. No, not a dream, something much softer, something much warmer. For the first time in years, JK felt safe. Outside the building, Jimin walked quietly down the deserted hallway, pulling his phone from his pocket. A single, unread message was already glowing on the screen. "Did you find him?" Jimin smiled softly, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he typed his reply. "You were right." A thumbs-up emoji appeared instantly from the other end, followed by a quick address: "Meet at our place." Jimin slipped the phone back into his blazer pocket. He paused, casting one final, lingering look back toward the heavy wooden doors of the old music room, while the rain tapped softly against the corridor windows. A small, quiet smile of pure relief washed over his face. Because, for the first time in a very long time, JK didn't look completely alone. The dining room was silent, except for the soft clinking of spoons against plates. Warm light spread across the luxurious house. But to JK, everything felt cold. JK sat alone at the dining table, forcing himself to eat despite the burning fever that weakened his body. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon. Since morning, he had barely eaten anything. His head throbbed painfully, and exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders. Still, he waited. He waited for them. The moment the front door opened, JK's tired eyes lit up instantly. "Mom, Dad." A small smile appeared on his pale face. Even through the dizziness and pain, relief washed over him. He quickly stood up from his chair, almost stumbling because of the weakness in his legs. For a second, he forgot his fever. He forgot the loneliness. He only wanted his parents to notice him. But fate was cruel. Mr. John walked into the dining room with a cold expression carved onto his face. Mrs. John followed silently behind him, equally distant. Without saying a word, Mr. John sat beside JK. Mrs. John sat across from them, looking at JK with eyes filled not with warmth, but pity. That look alone shattered something inside him. Mr. John placed a paper onto the glass table. His voice was icy. "What is the meaning of this, Jungkook?" JK's smile disappeared immediately. Slowly, he lowered his head. "The scores you got this time." Mr. John continued, his jaw tightening. "Why are they so low compared to your previous results?" JK's fingers curled tightly against his clothes. Not a single question about his health. Not a single "Are you okay?" Not even a glance at his pale face. Only grades. Only disappointment. His throat tightened painfully. I wasn't feeling well." "Respond properly, Jungkook." Mr. John's voice suddenly exploded through the room like thunder. He slammed his hand hard against the glass table. The sharp sound made JK flinch violently. His eyes instantly filled with tears. Mrs. John quickly touched her husband's arm. "Jagia, relax." Then she turned toward Jungkook. "Cookie, go to your room. We'll talk later. Go." Her voice was softer, but it carried no comfort. Jungkook didn't look at either of them. Silently, he turned around and walked away from the dining table. Each step felt heavy, painful. And then Mr. John's furious voice echoed behind him. See, why was he born such an idiot? Jungkook froze for a second. Useless. Completely useless. Every word pierced straight into his heart. He only knows how to disappoint me. Why was he even born to us? Something inside Jungkook broke. Completely. He rushed upstairs before they could see, the tears spilling uncontrollably down his face. The moment he entered his room, he locked the door with shaking hands. Click. The sound echoed in the dark room. Jungkook slowly leaned his back against the door. Before his body finally gave up, he slid down onto the floor. His knees pulled tightly against his chest as he buried his face between them. And then he cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just silent, broken sobs that shook his entire body. Tears streamed endlessly down his cheeks, soaking his sleeves. His fever burned hotter, but the pain in his chest hurt far more. He hadn't eaten properly all day. He hadn't rested. He hadn't heard a single comforting word. All he wanted was love, just once. But all he received was disappointment. He was in that dark room, surrounded by silence. The cold floor offered no comfort, holding Jungkook's fragile body like a lifeless figure. Throughout the endless night, as the hours crawled by, the freezing ground bled deep into his bones, aggressively worsening his cold and feeding the fire of his fever. At midnight, his eyelids fluttered open, heavy and strained. He was still collapsed on the hardwood floor of his bedroom. Every single muscle burned with an agonizing, sharp pain, summoning the last remnants of his strength. He dragged himself up, leaning his trembling back against the locked door. A bitter, painful smile broke across his pale lips. Chaos was the only standard in this house. That was why he loathed it here. A house. Some houses are sanctuaries built with unconditional love and radiant warmth. Others are nothing more than hollow cages, built from cold bricks. Yet, despite the cruelty, Jungkook still loved his parents. His high fever had prompted him to come home from the school hostel, desperately seeking comfort. Now, staring into the empty dark, he realized the lonely hostel was 1,000 times more peaceful than this prison. After sitting in the heavy silence, he forced his weak legs to carry him to the bed. He collapsed onto the mattress, resting his throbbing head against the headboard. As tears began to stream uncontrollably down his cheeks, his chest ached with a suffocating tightness. His heartbeat grew dangerously uneven, pulsing with a sharp, physical pain. After a long pause, he reached out with a shaking hand for his phone. On the bedside table, bright light pierced the darkness, revealing a single notification from an unknown number. Jungkook stared at the lock screen expressionlessly. He felt neither happiness nor sorrow, just a vast, echoing emptiness. The message read, "Are you okay?" He stared at those 3 words for what felt like eternity before finally tapping the screen to unlock it. "Hello, waving hand. I am Jimin. Are you okay? How do you feel? I searched for you today, and your classmate told me you were sick and went home." Jungkook read the text silently, over and over, until the phone screen timed out and turned black. He continued to stare into the dark reflection for a very long time. The next morning arrived without mercy. Jungkook was still frozen in the exact same position, having fallen into an exhausted sleep. While propped against the headboard, the bedroom door clicked open quietly. The family maid stepped into the room and walked toward the bed. "Hey kid, wake up. Your friends are waiting for you in the living room." Jungkook's eyes snapped open, his body jerking awake in a panic. "Ho, Ajumma, wake up," she repeated softly, her voice carrying a rare trace of gentleness. "Your friends are waiting downstairs." Without another word, she turned and left. Jungkook sat paralyzed on the bed, his mind racing. He forced his aching body to stand. After a long moment of hesitating by the edge of the mattress, he dragged his weak legs into the adjoining washroom. Stepping onto the cold tile, he looked into the mirror. The reflection staring back was unrecognizable. Sunken eyes, paper pale skin, and cheeks stained with the dried tracks of last night's tears. Turning on the tap, he splashed freezing water onto his face, trying to wash away the physical evidence of his breakdown and shock his feverish system awake. He gripped the edge of the sink with trembling hands, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass, before leaning over to brush his teeth and quickly make himself look presentable. Once he finished washing up, he slowly stepped out of the washroom. He hesitantly made his way down the grand staircase to the living room. The moment he stepped into the room, his eyes widened. Jimin was sitting on the sofa alongside two older men. The second Jimin spotted him. He surged to his feet and rushed over, his face twisted with intense worry. "Cookie, are you okay?" Jimin immediately pressed the back of his hand against Jungkook's forehead. His expression instantly crumbled with profound concern. "Hey, you have a dangerously high fever. Your body is literally burning." The other two men quickly approached, their eyes filled with deep, protective worry. "Come," one of them said, his voice dropping to a soothing, gentle register. "Jimin, help him sit on the sofa." Jungkook let himself be guided, sitting down blankly. After the emotional execution he had faced the night before, he felt completely numb. His face was entirely bloodless, hollowed out by exhaustion. One of the older men turned sharply to the other. "Hobie, go bring the medical kit from the car. And grab the fever medicine too." J-Hope nodded urgently and rushed out the front door. Within moments, he returned, carrying a professional medical box and a digital thermometer. He checked Jungkook's temperature with practiced, careful movements before placing the kit on the coffee table. "You haven't been eating or sleeping at all, have you?" the man asked, his voice dripping with pure kindness. Jungkook couldn't bear the warmth in his eyes. He lowered his head in a guilty, heartbreaking silence. Just then, the maid re-entered the room holding a cold bottle of juice. Seeing the heavy, worried atmosphere surrounding the young boy, she panicked slightly. "What happened to him? Is he all right?" "Don't worry, Ajama," Jimin reassured her, offering a comforting smile. "We'll take care of him. He'll be fine." J-Hope added gently, "Please, could you prepare some warm food for him?" She nodded quickly, visibly relieved, and hurried back to the kitchen. The three older boys exchanged soft, knowing smiles before Jimin sat down right next to Jungkook, placing a warm, grounding hand on his trembling shoulder. "Cookie," Jimin murmured softly, "these are my brothers, Jin Hyung and Hobie Hyung." Jungkook looked up, his eyes wide and trying to force a weak, grateful smile. They immediately returned it, their expressions filled with genuine warmth. "Cookie," Jimin continued, his voice dropping to a tender, earnest whisper, "I want to see you healthy. When I heard you were sick, I just had to know about your condition directly. I couldn't just sit around, and that's why I came straight here." Jimin squeezed his shoulder gently, looking over at the two older men. "And when I told this to my brothers, they also wanted to see you. They insisted on coming along to make sure you were okay." Jungkook listened, a lump forming in his throat as the realization washed over him. These strangers cared more about his fever than his own flesh and blood did. An hour later, Jin and J-Hope had to slip away to handle an unexpected emergency, leaving only Jimin and Jungkook behind in the quiet bedroom. Jungkook lay propped up against the pillows, while Jimin rested comfortably beside him on the mattress, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone. Jungkook stared at the ceiling for a long time, his chest swelling with an emotion he couldn't name. Slowly, he turned his head toward the older boy. "Hyung," he whispered, his voice cracking from sickness and emotion. Jimin instantly locked his phone and tossed it aside, turning his full, undivided attention to him. "Did you need something, Cookie?" Jungkook shook his head softly, a sudden wave of vulnerability washing over him. Jimin smiled in relief, stretching his hand out to gently brush his fingers through Jungkook's messy hair, a rhythmic, soothing motion. "Then what is it? Tell me." Jungkook hesitated, his lower lip trembling, as a question that had been haunting him finally broke free. Why? Jimin creased his brows slightly, his hand never stopping its gentle stroking. What do you mean, Kooky? Why do you care about me so much? We barely know each other. Without a single second of hesitation, Jimin answered, his voice a soft, unshakable vow. Because you're my little brother. Silence enveloped the room, heavy and profound. Jimin shifted his gaze up to the ceiling, a distant, tender look entering his eyes as he continued to stroke Jungkook's hair. To be honest, I noticed you randomly in different places around our school. I don't even know exactly when I started watching out for you, or why I started following you. Jimin paused, his chest heaving with a soft sigh. But whenever I saw you, you were always crying in dark, empty rooms. I heard your sobs, Kooky. I felt the absolute agony you were carrying. Jimin turned his head, his warm eyes locking directly into Jungkook's fractured gaze. Every single time I saw those teary eyes, something inside me screamed that I needed to protect you, like a real brother. That's why I finally came up to you that day. Jungkook remained entirely paralyzed, but the dam holding back his emotions broke. Hot tears spilled over his eyelids, tracing slow, agonizing paths down his temples. Jimin didn't turn away. He leaned forward and gently, tenderly wiped the tears away with his thumb. Don't cry anymore, Jimin whispered, his voice wrapping around Jungkook like a shield. I'm staying right here. You are never going to be alone again. He let out a bright, beautiful smile. You have me now, and you have our brothers too. Jimin chuckled softly, trying to lighten the heavy air. Jin Hyung is actually my stepbrother. Hobi Hyung is Jin Hyung's best friend. And we have 2 more brothers waiting to meet you. Namjoon Hyung, my brother-in-law, and Yoongi Hyung, another close friend of Jin Hyung. Jungkook listened intently, his heart hammering against his ribs at the mention of so many people willing to accept him. Jin Hyung is a pediatrician, and the rest of them run a massive business. Have you ever heard of the RYJ Group? Jungkook nodded slowly, his eyes suddenly widening in sheer disbelief. Yeah, Jimin grinned, poking Jungkook's cheek playfully. That's their company. Pure shock washed over Jungkook's pale face. The RYJ Group was one of the most terrifyingly powerful, elite conglomerates in the entire country. Jimin burst into a joyful, melodic laughter at Jungkook's stunned expression. Look at your face. You look like you've seen a ghost. For the first time in what felt like centuries, beautiful smile broke across Jungkook's face, his eyes crinkling with real happiness. And there, in that quiet, sunlit bedroom, far away from the icy demands, the heavy expectations, and the suffocating silence of his parents, strict rules, a sacred bond was forged. It was a lifeline thrown into his darkest hour. This new bond was completely untethered to bloodline, completely free from the conditional approval that had broken him the night before. Instead, it was written in the quiet vocabulary of pure love, fierce protection, and the beautiful, deliberate choice to become a family.
After being with Park Jimin, Jungkook slowly started becoming his true self again. The innocence buried deep inside Jungkook, the childishness he had hidden for years, slowly began to resurface. He had changed so much. His smiles became genuine. His laughter sounded lighter. For the first time in years he felt like he could breathe without suffocating from fear. But happiness is often a fleeting visitor. Jimin had to move abroad for his higher studies. Yet, no matter how vast the distance between them grew, Jimin never forgot Jungkook. Whenever he found a spare moment between his grueling studies, he would call. Sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. Just hearing Jimin's voice became the fragile lifeline Jungkook needed to survive another day. Slowly, Jungkook also started connecting with others. It became the only relief in his agonizingly lonely life. Now, years later, he had finally graduated from high school. Officially, he returned back to his family home. No more hostel life. No more lonely nights staring silently at a blank ceiling. Yet somehow, the house still didn't feel like home. At dinner time, Both Mr. and Mrs. John sat directly opposite Jungkook. The room echoed only with the harsh clinking of spoons against porcelain plates. The silence was cold, heavy, and suffocating. Jungkook sat stiffly in his chair, terror visible in every line of his body.
His hands trembled slightly. He lowered his head, pretending to focus intensely on his food, just to avoid eye contact with them. Appa, Alma. His voice came out as a fragile whisper. Mrs. John looked up first. Yeah, baby Cookie, she asked gently, though her eyes remained detached. What do you want? A pause. A long, suffocating, nervous pause. Jungkook swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tasting like pure fear. He hesitated, his fingers tightening so hard around his spoon that his knuckles turned white. I want to study music. His voice shook violently now. I really love it, please. Shut up, Jungkook. The words exploded through the dining room like a gunshot. Mr. John's face turned crimson with instant fury, his own hands shaking with uncontrollable rage. What utter nonsense are you talking about? Jungkook flinched violently, pulling his shoulders inward. But he didn't dare raise his head. Instead, he silently tightened his grip on the spoon, trying to ground himself. Before Jungkook could utter another syllable, Mrs. John cut him off. He's just a child. Mrs. John muttered bitterly to her husband, talking about her son as if he weren't even in the room. Mr. John replied to his wife in a cold voice. This is just some stupid, immature whim. He knows absolutely nothing about real life. Mrs. John quickly placed her hand over her husband's trembling one, attempting to soothe his anger. Then she turned her gaze toward Jungkook. Cookie, she said softly, do you even comprehend what you're saying? Her voice sounded perfectly calm, but it was stripped of all warmth. We are your parents. We know what is best for you. You are still a child. You don't know anything about the world. Jungkook slowly lifted his eyes to look at them. Deep, profound pain sat quietly in his gaze. Then, defeated, he lowered his head once more. His voice trembled weakly, cracking under the weight of his own despair. I am a human being. A heavy tear threatened to spill from his eyes. I have my own likes and dislikes too. Slap. The violent sound cracked across the room. Jungkook's face snapped to the side from the force of the blow. The spoon slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the plate with a loud, metallic clatter. Stop it, Jungkook. Mr. John roared, his chest heaving with fury. If you continue this pathetic nonsense, I don't know what I'll do to you. But Jungkook didn't stop, even while shaking down to his bones. Even while utterly terrified, he still whispered through his pain. Appa, please. Tears blurred his vision, spilling over his burning cheek. I love music. Another slap. Then another. Again and again. Each strike landed harder than the last, fueled by unbridled rage. Mrs. John immediately rushed forward and grabbed her husband's arm, pulling him back. Enough. She quickly turned to the trembling boy. Jungkook, she ordered sharply, her voice devoid of sympathy. Say sorry to Appa right now. Jungkook remained frozen, suffocating in his own silence. His refusal to speak only made the atmosphere more volatile. Mrs. John's eyes widened slightly in disbelief at his defiance. Meanwhile, Mr. John's expression grew terrifyingly dark. Where did he even learn this rebellious behavior? Mrs. John asked coldly, looking toward her husband. I think he needs professional counseling, JJ. Jungkook looked up at his mother, utter heartbreak and disbelief shattering his features. I don't need counseling, Amma. That was the final straw. Mr. John suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Jungkook harshly by the wrist, his grip bruising. He dragged him forcefully out of the dining room. Appa. Jungkook cried out, stumbling blindly. The bedroom door opened violently. Mr. John threw Jungkook into the pitch-black room. Jungkook lost his footing, stumbling badly, before collapsing onto the hard floor. Don't you dare speak another word. Mr. John growled coldly. I know exactly how to handle you. He began to slam the door shut, Pure panic immediately flooded Jungkook's entire body. He scrambled to his feet and rushed toward the closing gap. "Appa, please." His voice cracked in sheer desperation. "Please don't lock me in, don't close the door." Mr. John stared back at him through the narrowing space. His eyes were dead. No emotion, no hesitation. Then, he delivered the words that completely mutilated Jungkook's soul. "You are the absolute worst decision of my life." Click. The lock turned. Jungkook froze completely, the breath trapped in his throat. Those words began to echo inside his head, louder and louder, mutating into a deafening roar. Jungkook froze completely, the breath trapped in his throat. Those words began to echo inside his head, louder and louder, mutating into a deafening roar. Worst decision, worst decision, worst decision. He stood entirely alone in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by cold, unyielding walls. Silent tears rolled down his cheeks uncontrollably. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob. It was just the quiet, hopeless weeping of a child who had spent his entire existence begging for love and the freedom to chase his dreams from the very people who tore him apart. His chest ached with a physical, crushing agony. His breathing became shallow and uneven. Slowly, his strength evaporated, and his body gave out, causing him to collapse into a helpless heap on the freezing floor. Alone, broken, abandoned. In that suffocating darkness, Jungkook realized a cruel, undeniable truth. Not every parent deserves a child, but every child deserves parents who give them love instead of trauma. After the chaos, he remained locked inside that suffocating room, not for a few hours, and not just for a day, but for an entire agonizing night and the grueling day that followed. He sat completely unmoving on the freezing floor, frozen like a stone statue. The silence around him was terrifying. No tears that no screams, just a hollow, echoing emptiness. That was the exact moment Jungkook died inside. Not physically, but emotionally. The boy who had finally learned to laugh freely. The boy who had found a fragile relief from his dark loneliness through his music and dreams. The boy who loved so deeply, completely disappeared behind a flawless mask of perfection. From that tragic day forward, he became nothing more than a program machine, living only to survive. He buried the bleeding hole in his heart so deeply that no one could see it. He didn't even show his pain to his brothers. Instead, he hid it behind a wall of silence. He smiled mechanically whenever they met. He answered in hollow tones when they spoke. But his shattered soul had already stopped reaching out for anyone. Then came another sudden change. After forced agreements were made, his parents prepared everything. Within a few months of passing his entrance exams, Jungkook was shipped off to an university abroad, the exact same university where Jimin was studying. And ironically, that became Jungkook's only saving grace. Both of them majored in business, but the stark difference between them was absolutely heartbreaking. For Jimin, business was a cherished dream he had chased with genuine passion and fierce determination. For Jungkook, it was merely a heavy shackle forced into his hands. Another cold responsibility, another miserable cage. At first, Jimin noticed the haunting distance in him, the blank, dead expressions, the mechanical, rehearsed replies, the hollow, sleepless eyes that carried horrific stories. Jungkook never spoke aloud. Slowly, piece by piece, Jimin discovered the ugly truth behind Jungkook's broken, new version. But unlike everyone else, Jimin never blamed him. He never criticized him. He never asked him to just fix himself. Instead, he stayed by Jungkook's side, safeguarding his buried dreams. Quietly, patiently, gently, Jimin understood Jungkook better than anyone ever had. Not merely like a brother, but almost like a protective mother shielding a deeply wounded child from the storm. Even when Jungkook failed to express his feelings properly, Jimin could still decipher the agonizing pain hidden behind every heavy silence. And for Jungkook, Jimin became the only medicine capable of soothing the raging storm inside his chest. He was the only person who made breathing feel less painful. Little by little, under Jimin's constant, unconditional encouragement, something inside Jungkook started shifting again. Not completely, not instantly, but slowly. The dead dreams inside him began to breathe once more. Jimin constantly reminded him of the vibrant boy he used to be, the boy who once possessed his own fierce ambitions, his own beautiful passion, his own identity, and for the first time in years, Jungkook finally chose something for himself. He began secretly working toward his real dream. He resolutely stepped away from the tragic script others had written for his life and started building his own path. That was the true beginning of Jungkook's solo journey, not just toward success, but toward finding the pieces of himself again. Jungkook worked endlessly for his dream. Days blended seamlessly into nights, and nights completely disappeared into endless, grueling practice sessions. Sleep became a distant stranger to him. Food became nothing more than a minor inconvenience. All he cared about was improving, perfecting every single note, every complex chord, and every fragile breath that escaped his lips while singing. Hour after hour, he sat isolated in his room, with his guitar resting heavy against his lap. His fingers were bruised and raw from constant playing, and his eyes burned with deep exhaustion. Yet he never stopped, because, for the very first time in his life, he was finally chasing something that truly belonged to him. And the only person who constantly witnessed that silent, agonizing struggle was Jimin. They lived together in Jimin's cozy apartment. Even though Jungkook's parents had provided him with his own luxurious place, he never stayed there. The empty, sterile walls felt suffocating, and somehow Jimin's presence made the crushing loneliness hurt just a little less. But there was one thing they fought about almost every single day: Jungkook's failing health. One quiet morning, golden sunlight slipped softly through the sheer curtains while the faint, melancholy sound of a guitar echoed through the apartment. Jungkook had practiced the entire night again. No sleep, no breakfast, just an obsession with music. The bedroom door creaked open. Jimin stepped inside slowly, crossing his arms tightly as he leaned against the doorway. His face carried a carefully manufactured expression of anger, but the deep-seated concern hidden in his eyes was impossible to mask. His voice came out soft, yet cold enough to make Jungkook's fingers pause on the strings. "Kooky, you didn't eat breakfast. And don't you dare tell me you slept last night, because I know for a fact you didn't." He sighed quietly, the sound heavy with worry, before continuing. "What exactly is your plan, HM? To destroy yourself?" The guitar strings fell completely silent. Jungkook immediately stood up from the bed, walking toward Jimin like a guilty child caught doing something wrong. Then he deployed his most dangerous, effective weapon, that innocent bunny smile, the same soft, endearing smile that could instantly melt every ounce of anger Jimin tried so desperately to hold on to. "Jimin SHI," Jungkook whined softly, dragging out the syllables with a cute, exaggerated pout. "I'm sorry." He crossed his arms awkwardly before reaching up to grab his own ears, mimicking a punished child begging for forgiveness. And just like that, Jimin's fake anger shattered into a million pieces. A helpless, affectionate smile escaped his lips. "Seriously, what am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered softly. Jimin stepped closer and gently brushed away Jungkook's messy, overgrown hair, his fingers moving with so much tenderness that it almost felt painful. "Kooky," he said quietly, his voice now overflowing with raw warmth. "I know exactly how much this dream means to you." His expression softened even further. "But your health matters more than anything in this world. If you collapse, none of this will matter anymore." He lightly tapped Jungkook's forehead. "So don't put me through this again, okay?" Jungkook immediately nodded with a giggling smile, his eyes curving into happy crescents. And for a beautiful moment, everything felt peaceful. But promises made by exhausted people rarely last long. Jungkook continued pushing himself straight to the edge. Fueled by Jimin's unwavering encouragement, he eventually started singing and playing guitar part-time under a small, indie entertainment brand. It wasn't famous. It wasn't luxurious. But for Jungkook, it was the single biggest, most beautiful opportunity he had ever received. He laughed more. He smiled genuinely. He breathed freely, like a prisoner finally escaping a lifetime in a cage. Music became his only real home. But while his shattered heart was finally healing, his body was slowly breaking apart. At first, it was just a slight, persistent raw pain in his throat while singing. Then came the deep body aches, the constant, dizzying exhaustion, the sudden, alarming weight loss. Still, he willfully ignored it all. He desperately convinced himself it was normal. Just a lack of sleep, skipped meals, and standard overworking. Nothing serious. At least, that's what he desperately wanted to believe. But life never allows happiness to stay untouched for too long. The final results of the first university semester arrived, and they destroyed Jungkook completely. His grades were only slightly above average. For anyone else, it might have been an acceptable score, but not for his parents. Not for people who only measured a human soul's worth through mathematical perfection. The moment Mr. and Mrs. John found out, they didn't just call, they immediately traveled abroad to see him. And the absolute, paralyzing fear that flooded Jungkook's eyes that day made him look exactly like the terrified, broken boy he used to be before Jimin had saved him. The entire ride to Jungkook's apartment felt unbearably heavy. Outside the car window, the city lights blurred past in a silent smear. But inside the vehicle, the tension was suffocating. Jungkook sat beside Jimin, his trembling hands clenched so tightly against his knees that his knuckles turned white. His breathing was shallow and uneven. His thoughts roared louder than anything around him. Fear, pure, paralyzing fear. It wasn't just because of the low grades. It wasn't just the dread of disappointment. It was because deep inside, he already knew the nightmare that was waiting for him. Jimin noticed every agonizing detail. The way Jungkook kept biting the inside of his cheek until it bled. The way his fingers shook uncontrollably. The way he refused to lift his head, hiding behind his hair. "It's going to be okay," Jimin whispered softly, reaching out. But even he knew the words carried no weight, no real certainty. Jungkook could only offer a weak, forced nod, staring blankly ahead. When they finally stepped into the apartment, the atmosphere instantly turned ice cold. Mr. and Mrs. John were already waiting in the living room. Mrs. John sat rigidly on the couch, desperately trying to maintain a smile that looked painfully fragile, shattering at the edges. Beside her sat Mr. John, arms crossed, his expression hardened into stone. The simmering fury in his eyes was impossible to hide. Jimin bowed politely, his voice tight. "Annyeonghaseyo ajiase, ajama." Mrs. John nodded gently, her voice strained. "Sit down, both of you. I'll bring some juice." She hurried toward the kitchen, her movements hurried, almost as if she were desperately trying to escape the suffocating tension herself. Then a heavy, deafening silence returned. Mr. John finally spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet. "How are you, Jimin?" "I'm fine, Ajiase," Jimin answered respectfully, trying to anchor the room. Mr. John nodded once before slowly, deliberately turning his piercing gaze toward Jungkook. Jungkook's head immediately dropped lower, his shoulders tensing. The air in the room grew thicker, harder to breathe. Sensing the violent panic building inside Jungkook, Jimin quietly stood up. "Excuse me, I need to make a quick call." The moment Jungkook looked up at him, his eyes were wide, pooling with absolute terror. "Don't leave me," they begged. Jimin gently closed his eyes for a second, offering a silent, desperate reassurance. He murmured softly, just enough for Jungkook to hear. "I'll be right back." Jungkook hesitated, swallowing hard, before giving a tiny, trembling nod. The moment the front door clicked shut behind Jimin, the fragile silence shattered. Mr. John's cold, demanding voice echoed off the walls. "What is your plan now?" Jungkook remained frozen. It wasn't because he wanted to be disrespectful or defiant. It was because fear had wrapped its suffocating hands around his throat. stealing his voice entirely. That silence only threw fuel onto the fire of Mr. John's anger. Jungkook. The roar shattered the room. Jungkook flinched violently, his fingers clawing into his own clothes as his breathing fractured into ragged gasps. Appa, I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses. And within seconds, everything exploded. Mr. John lunged forward, grabbing Jungkook violently and throwing him onto the hard floor. A sickening, painful thud echoed through the living room as Jungkook's body hit the ground. And within seconds, everything exploded. How dare you look away from me when I am speaking to you? Mr. John shouted furiously. Jungkook immediately curled into a ball on the floor, shaking violently as tears finally spilled over. Did you forget who raised you? Who gave you everything? Mr. John hissed, his face contorted in rage. Fine, then I'll remind you. The sharp, metallic click of a belt unbuckling made Jungkook freeze completely, his blood running cold. No, please. Before he could even attempt to scramble away, the first heavy blow landed. Mrs. John screamed instantly, a sound of pure agony. Jai, stop. Please stop. She rushed forward desperately, throwing her own body over Jungkook to shield him from his father's wrath. Jungkook cried out, a raw, broken sound, helplessly trying to tuck his limbs in to protect himself. And at that exact moment, the front door burst open. Jimin returned. His eyes widened in sheer horror at the scene before him. Stop. Without a second thought, Jimin threw himself into the chaos, pulling a trembling Jungkook behind his own back, to act as a human shield against the older man's blind rage. Meanwhile, Mrs. John desperately tried to stop her husband. The living room descended into utter madness. Crying, shouting, the suffocating sound of broken, hyperventilating breaths. Until finally everything stopped. Jungkook sat on the floor, with Jimin sitting right beside him to support him. Tears streamed endlessly down his pale face, and his chest heaved. When he finally spoke, his voice was so hollow, so terribly cracked. It didn't even sound like him. I hate this. Appa. Alma. The confession broke into an uncontrollable sob. I hate this life. Mrs. John froze, her heart stopping at the sheer despair in her son's voice. Just give me one chance. Jungkook begged weakly, his hands gripping the carpet as he looked up at both of his parents. What are you saying? She cried out, her own tears falling. You don't understand how the world works yet. Jungkook, you don't understand life. Jungkook's head snapped up, and for the first time in his entire life, he interrupted her. No, he whispered, the words dripping with years of unsaid agony. You don't understand me. The words struck Mrs. John like a physical blow, silencing her instantly. You never loved me. Jungkook choked out, his voice shattering completely. Jimin stayed, glued to his side, his hand gripping Jungkook's shoulder with all the strength he had left, trying to keep him from falling apart completely. Jungkook's tears poured endlessly now, a dam breaking on years of repressed trauma and loneliness. You know how terrified I am of being alone. He wept, his voice trembling violently. But you still packed my bags and sent me away to that hostel. I hated every single night there. His breathing became dangerously ragged. I slept alone in the pitch dark. I ate alone at those giant tables. I lived completely alone. Nobody cared about me. Nobody played with me. Nobody stayed beside me when I was scared. Mrs. John's face completely crumbled, her hand flying to her mouth as the harsh reality of her son's childhood was laid bare. And every single time my grades dropped, you never asked if I was okay. You only demanded to know why. Jungkook let out a bitter, heartbroken laugh through his tears. Do you have any idea how hard I tried? He pressed his trembling hands flat against the floor, shaking his head. In that exam hall, my mind always went completely blank. Fear paralyzed me. I tried my best. I swear to God I tried my best, but I always failed. The room fell into a deathly silence, save for his broken, pathetic sobs. I'm so tired, Appa. That single sentence shattered something fundamental inside everyone present. I just want my own life, his voice cracked, reduced to a desperate plea. I just want to breathe freely for once in my life, without feeling like I'm choking. Slowly, his tear-filled eyes lifted to meet his father's rigid gaze. But you don't care about that. You only care about perfection, power, status. A painful, mocking smirk appeared on his trembling lips. That's the real reason you even allowed me to become close with Jimin Hyung, isn't it? Mr. and Mrs. John froze, their expressions locking up. Because his family is wealthy. Because of his family's high status. Because it's good for business. Jungkook's tears fell faster, burning his cheeks. No one answered. The silence was incriminating. I don't need your expectations anymore, he whispered, his energy completely depleted. I just needed your love. At that, Jimin could no longer hold his own emotions back. He pulled Jungkook tightly into his arms, crushing him against his chest. Jungkook broke down completely, burying his face into Jimin's shoulder, crying so violently that his entire body convulsed. Jimin held him like he was trying to glue every broken piece of Jungkook's soul back together, his own silent tears soaking into Jungkook's hair. Mrs. John collapsed forward, covering her face as she wept uncontrollably. Only Mr. John remained standing entirely still, like a statue carved of stone. But beneath the surface, his world was imploding. For the first time in his life, a terrifying, suffocating realization hit him. He had completely failed as a father. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. John finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its previous thunder, but still laced with a stubborn pride. I'll give you one last chance. Everyone looked up at him through blurred vision. Forget everything that just happened here. We will wipe the slate clean and restart. Mrs. John nodded slowly, utterly exhausted by the heavy truths that had finally surfaced. She crawled closer, kneeling on the floor right in front of Jungkook. Her trembling, cold hands gently cupped his wet face, forcing him to look at her. Baby Cookie, she whispered brokenly, her voice cracking. You've misunderstood us all this time. We love you so much. You are our entire world. Jungkook looked back at her with completely shattered, empty eyes. Then Mr. John spoke again, drawing a final, hard line in the sand. If you like music, so much fine, then sing. Sing as a hobby. For a fraction of a second, a fragile spark of hope flickered weakly in Jungkook's eyes. But the very next sentence brutally extinguished it. But I will never, under any circumstances, allow music to become your career. The tiny light vanished from Jungkook's face entirely, leaving behind a hollow shell. Mr. John looked directly into his son's eyes, issuing a cold, final ultimatum. You can choose right now, your family or your dream. Jimin stared at the man in absolute, horrified disbelief. Even after everything, after hearing the depths of Jungkook's pain, his loneliness, his cries for help, they still couldn't understand him. It was like trying to draw lines on water. No matter how much soul Jungkook poured out, nothing stayed. Nothing changed. Jimin felt his own heart fracture alongside Jungkook's. After a long, agonizing silence, Jungkook finally spoke. His voice was trembling, but underneath the shakes, it was terrifyingly firm. I choose my dream. Mrs. John's eyes widened in sheer horror. Jungkook, she whispered, her voice laced with immense heartbreak. Is it really that important to you? More important than us? Jungkook immediately shook his head, fresh tears spilling over. No, Amma, I'm not saying you aren't important. Even now, bruised and bleeding on the floor, he was still trying to reach them. He was still trying to make them understand. But Mr. John had already turned his back. Come, he said, his voice dropping to a freezing, detached tone as he looked at his wife. Let's go. Without casting a single glance backward at his bleeding, broken son, Mr. John walked out of the apartment. Mrs. John looked at Jungkook one last time, her eyes swimming with a devastating mix of love, anger, and heartbreak. Then slowly, she turned around and followed her husband into the night. The heavy front door clicked shut, and a crushing, absolute silence consumed the room once more. Jungkook remained sitting motionless on the floor, staring at the empty space where his parents had just been, looking as if his very soul had been ripped from his body. Jimin suddenly scrambled to his feet, sprinting out the door after Mr. and Mrs. John, desperately shouting their names, trying one last time to make them understand the gravity of what they were throwing away. But they were too deeply wounded by their own rigid beliefs to listen anymore. Their footsteps faded away. Back inside the apartment, Jungkook sat entirely alone in the dead center of the broken silence. He stared at his trembling hands, utterly lost, unable to comprehend what terrible sin he had committed by simply wanting to live as himself. And that night, the bitter, uncompromising truth destroyed both sides completely, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. Jungkook chose his dream the day he walked away from everything he once knew. Not because it was easy, but because staying behind felt heavier than leaving. He abandoned the comfort of expectation and stepped into uncertainty, with nothing but music in his hands and fire in his heart.
He returned to his hometown and enrolled as a music major with the help of Jimin and his other youngs. By day, he was just another student. By night, he exhausted himself with part-time jobs just to survive. At first, he tried living alone in a cramped rented apartment. He foolishly thought that distance would protect the others from his burdens. But loneliness has a strange way of growing louder in the silence. The people who refused to let him disappear were still by his side. Jimin, Jin, Jope, Namjoon and Yoongi. They all stood firmly against one thing, letting him be alone. In the end, Jungkook gave in, moving into an apartment with Yoongi and J-Hope. It wasn't because of luxury, but in those shared spaces, something beautiful happened. It became a family. Meanwhile, life moved forward for the others too. Jimin returned to his family's business under his father's guidance. Jin and Namjoon married, moving into their own homes to start quiet, beautiful new chapters. Yoongi and Jimin's relationship blossomed. Their engagement wasn't rushed or blind, but something that grew slowly and naturally, like trust finally finding a safe place to rest. Jope, always the warm-hearted soul, continued his work, all while quietly holding on to a one-sided love he never dared to confess out loud. And Jungkook just ran. He ran toward music like it was the only oxygen left to breathe. But somewhere along the way, his body started falling behind. At first, the signs were quiet. A small cough after practice, a sharp pinch of pain when hitting high notes. A sudden dizzy spell he quickly brushed off. He told himself it was just exhaustion, nothing more. So, he pushed harder and harder. Painkillers became his daily routine. Meals became optional. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Every agonizing sacrifice was justified by a single haunting belief: I have to be perfect. Slowly, his voice began to echo across the world. His songs gained attention. His talent spread like wildfire, quietly at first, then exploding everywhere. People began to revere the name J.K. Not Jungkook, just J.K. A mysterious, rising prodigy whose face no one knew, but every time happiness visited him, his body responded with something darker. The coughs grew violent. The fatigue tore deeper into his bones. The pain became sharper, more agonizing. Yet every time his brothers confronted him, begging him to see a doctor, Jungkook would only smile. That soft, familiar bunny smile, that innocent expression that always disarmed them. I'm fine, he would whisper, and somehow, he always convinced them. Or maybe, they just didn't want to believe otherwise. Because behind that smile, they were all terrified. They were afraid that if they pushed him too hard, he would run away and disappear completely. Jungkook kept his real identity and face hidden from the world. To the public, JK was a mask of him. He was constantly plagued by the paralyzing fear that people may accept him and his talent. Behind the closed doors of the practice room, his body was quietly breaking. The coughs became suffocating during his vocal sessions. Sometimes he had to pause mid-performance, gripping his chest in sheer agony. His skin grew deathly pale, and his weight dropped dangerously without warning. Still, he refused to stop. In his mind, stopping meant failure, and failure meant losing the only identity he had left. Then came the ultimate opportunity, a massive concert. the biggest stage of his life. It would be the first time the world would see his face and learn his real name. It was his ultimate dream, the proof that his painful choices had been right. The night before the performance, he stood alone on the empty stage, practicing under the dim rehearsal lights. The haunting echo of his voice filled the massive hollow hall. Watching from the shadows of the back rows were Jimin, Jope, and Yoongi. They didn't speak much about his health anymore. They were tired of arguing, but they were never tired of caring. Jimin's voice finally broke the heavy silence, frustration masking his deep worry. He never listens. How many times did we tell him to go to a hospital? J-Hope sighed, his heart aching. He's not ignoring us, Jimin. He's just desperate to prove to his parents that his choice wasn't wrong. Yoongi leaned back, his expression unreadable but tense. After this rehearsal, he said, his voice low and absolute, we are dragging him to the hospital. No more excuses. On stage, Jungkook poured his soul into another high note. And then, he stopped. His entire body froze. A violent, agonizing cough tore through his chest. It was harder than before, deeper, and terribly wrong. He clamped his hand over his mouth. When he pulled it away, his palm was stained with dark, crimson blood. The world ground to a halt. His vision blurred into a smear of colors, and his legs completely gave out. "JK!" The panicked shout echoed through the empty arena too late. Jungkook collapsed heavily onto the hard stage. Everything erupted into chaos. Footsteps thundered against the floor. Screams pierced the air. Jimin was the first to reach him, dropping heavily to his knees and pulling Jungkook's limp body into his arms. Hey, look at me!" Jimin's voice cracked, tears spilling over. "Stay awake, please. Kooky, look at me." Jope and Yoongi arrived seconds later, pure panic written across their faces. Blood stained Jungkook's pale lips. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and terrifyingly weak. Without hesitation, they rushed his frail body to the hospital. Time lost all meaning in the sterile hallway. It was too quiet, too clean, and unimaginably cruel. Soon Jin appeared alongside the attending physician. Jimin scrambled to his feet, rushing toward him. "Hyung, what happened? Is he okay? Tell me he's okay." Jope and Yoongi stepped up right behind him, their breaths hitched in anxiety, but Jin didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. His shattered expression delivered the devastating news long before his lips could form the words. "Come to my cabin," Jin managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Nobody wanted to move, paralyzed by an impending sense of dread, but they followed him inside. A suffocating silence settled over the cabin, heavy and crushing. Jimin couldn't take it anymore. "Hyung, just tell me," he pleaded, his voice shaking violently. "Is he going to be okay? He's just going to wake up and need rest, right? We'll take care of him, we promise." But Jin didn't move, he didn't interrupt. He only looked up, and in that single, heartbroken gaze, their entire world shattered. Yoongi and Jope sat frozen, their chests tightening as they realized something was deeply, irreversibly wrong. Jin's hands trembled against his desk as he leaned forward. When he spoke, his voice was a fragile whisper. "Kooky." He paused, his breath hitching as a sob threatened to break through. "He's not well." Jimin exhaled a sharp, desperate breath, trying to force a smile. "I know. We know he's exhausted. We'll make him rest, Jin Hyung. We'll—" "Jimin," Jin interrupted softly, his eyes brimming with painful tears. "Kooky is in the 3rd stage of cancer." The words dropped like a lead weight, yet they didn't seem to land. The room didn't react. For a fleeting second, it felt as though reality itself refused to accept the sentence. Then, the world stopped spinning. Jimin froze completely, the air leaving his lungs. Jope's breath hitched in his throat as a quiet gasp escaped him. Yoongi's expression darkened to a terrifying degree, his hands clenching into tight fists to hide his trembling. "What?" Jimin whispered, the word barely audible. Jin lowered his gaze, unable to bear the sight of his brother's breaking. "His body is extremely weak. He has been carrying this completely alone for a very long time." Jimin stood motionless, as if his body had forgotten how to breathe, his mind utterly rejecting the diagnosis. Because Jungkook wasn't just their youngest brother, he wasn't just their best friend, he wasn't just the famous JK, he was the boy they always ran to protect, the one who smiled brightest even when he was hurting inside. The one who called them Hyung like the word itself was a shield. The boy who had never learned how to ask for help. Jimin's eyes slowly filled with tears, but they trapped themselves on his eyelashes, refusing to fall. His body was in too much shock to even allow him to cry. Outside that quiet cabin, far down a long, sterile hallway, Jungkook lay unconscious in a cold hospital bed, hooked up to whirring machines. And for the first time in their lives, a terrifying truth settled into the hearts of his Hyungs. Fame hadn't broken him, the pressure hadn't broken him, his own agonizing silence had. And now, looking at the clock ticking on the wall, they realized there might not be enough time left to fix it. The next day, Jungkook slowly opened his eyes. For a few agonizing seconds, everything blurred. The stark white ceiling lights, the distant rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor, and the faint, cold smell of medicine. Then, reality hit him like a physical blow. A hospital. He tried to sit up immediately. Pain shot through his entire body, sharp and unforgiving, but he still forced himself upward, his stubborn mind refusing to accept a single second of weakness. The bathroom door clicked open. Jimin stepped out into the room and froze. "Cookie, what are you doing?" Panic cracked through his voice instantly. Jungkook turned his head slowly, his dry throat struggling to form words. He spoke in a fragile whisper. "Hyung." A small breathless pause followed as he gathered the strength just to breathe. "You forgot." Jimin blinked, his heart sinking into his chest. Jungkook forced a faint, painful breath, a desperate light flickering in his eyes. "Today is my performance day. The day I finally reveal my true identity to the world." There it was. That quiet, innocent hope shining in his eyes, burning bright as if nothing had happened, as if his body wasn't quietly failing him. And that innocent look was what broke Jimin completely. Tears slipped out without permission, rolling hot down his cheeks, one, then another. Jimin tried to swallow them down, tried to catch his breath, tried to stand tall and be the strong older brother, but he couldn't. The dam broke. Jungkook stared at him, utterly confused. This was the first time in his life he had ever seen Jimin look so utterly defeated. "Hyung," Jungkook whispered, his voice trembling. "What happened?" Jimin turned his back immediately. He couldn't look at him. Not yet. His hands clenched into tight fists by the sides of his clothes as he fought to control his shaking, shallow breaths. A suffocating silence filled the room. Then, slowly, Jimin turned around. He wiped his tears quickly on his sleeve, stepped closer to the bed, and cradled Jungkook's pale face with trembling hands. His voice came out entirely shattered. "Cookie." He took a sharp breath, trying to steady himself. "Listen to me." Jungkook's wide eyes searched his face, completely unaware of the darkness waiting for him. "We'll all be with you," Jimin continued, his voice shaking harder with every syllable. "You're strong, right?" Jungkook stared at him quietly. A cold dread settled in his chest. Something felt wrong, terrifyingly wrong. Jimin took a deep breath, one that didn't fully reach his lungs. "Tonight, you're not performing." Jungkook's eyes widened, a sudden panic replacing the hope. "What?" "You need to rest," Jimin said softly, his voice turning into a desperate plea. "Your body is begging you to stop." Jungkook's eyes instantly filled with tears. "Hyung, what are you saying? Please no." Jimin couldn't bear the look on his face any longer. He wrapped his arms around Jungkook, pulling him into a fierce, crushing hug. It was too tight, as if Jimin were physically trying to hold his younger brother's breaking soul together. His hand trembled against the back of Jungkook's neck as he buried his face in the boy's shoulder. "Cookie." Jin's devastating words from the night before echoed in Jimin's mind, and his voice completely shattered. "You're in the 3rd stage of throat cancer." The sentence didn't just echo through the room, it crushed it. Silence swallowed everything in its path. Jungkook didn't move, he didn't speak, he didn't even gasp. It was as if his entire body had forgotten how to exist in a single second. Then, a single tear fell from his left eye. Slow, heavy, painful. Then another followed from the right. That was it. There was no scream of denial, there was no rage, there was only a devastating hollow silence. It was the sound of a beautiful dream breaking without making a single noise. Jimin held him even tighter, crying silently into his hospital gown. But Jungkook was already gone. He had retreated somewhere deep inside himself, a faraway place where human voices could no longer reach him. After that morning, everything changed. The cold hospital room became his entire world. Days and nights bled into one another, completely stripping time of its meaning. He sat perfectly still for hours on end, staring blankly at the empty wall, sleepless, silent, like a body that had forgotten how to live. Treatments came and went. Doctors murmured diagnoses. Nurses moved softly around his bed. Yet, Jungkook remained entirely unchanged, still as stone. Slowly, his body began to mirror his emotional silence. The heavy medications didn't work the way the doctors hoped they would, because his spirit had already surrendered. The vibrant strength he once possessed faded away into nothing. His voice, the beautiful instrument that was once so full of life, started disappearing little by little, turning into a raspy, painful whisper. Even his smile, that bright, familiar bunny smile that always melted his young's hearts, was entirely gone. His hair thinned, his frail body weakened further, his cheeks hollowed out, and deep, dark circles settled under his eyes like permanent shadows. He no longer looked like the Jungkook they knew. He looked like a masterpiece the world was slowly erasing. Everyone tried. Jimin, Jin, Jope, Yoongi, and Namjoon. They all tried desperately to pull him back from the edge. They tried to reach him, to talk to him, to bring him back home. But Jungkook never responded. Because the tragic truth was devastatingly simple. The pain of losing his dream was far louder than any physical pain tearing through his body. The one thing that had kept him fighting to survive, his music, had now become the very reason he was breaking. Losing his dream right in front of his eyes, completely hopeless and unable to do anything but just let it happen, was the worst trauma. And now even hope didn't feel like hope anymore. It was just a beautiful distant light that he could no longer reach. Back to reality, Jungkook slowly opened his eyes. The world around him was dim and completely colorless. The faint, rhythmic beeping of the machines echoed through the cold ICU, while the heavy ventilator breathed for him in a slow, mechanical cadence. Cold air, white walls, the sterile smell of medicine, and the heavy presence of death lingered together in the silence. Tears still flowed silently from the corners of his eyes, sliding across his temples, before disappearing into the damp pillow beneath him. He couldn't move, he couldn't speak, he could barely even breathe on his own. Then,
Taeyoung stood quietly beside the bed, still, silent. Their eyes met, but this time, Taeyoung's expression was unreadable. There was no comfort. There was no softness. Only something unbearably heavy hidden deep inside his dark, hollow eyes. Jungkook stared up at him weakly, and inside his fracturing mind, his voice finally broke. What fault lay within my choices? Another tear rolled down slowly. Was I wrong to chase my dream? Was it a sin to want to breathe freely for once? Was it wrong to just want to prove myself? The questions echoed painfully inside his chest. Like old wounds reopening one by one, Taeyoung remained silent for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. His voice was cold, but underneath the ice, something cracked quietly. The choice was ignoring your own body. Jungkook's eyes trembled beneath his heavy lids. You chose your soul. Taeyoung continued softly, his voice dropping to a fragile whisper. And you abandoned the body that carried it. The harsh hiss of the ventilator filled the silence between his words. What you did to yourself is the exact same thing your parents did to you. Those words hit harder than any physical pain ever could. To become perfect. Taeyoung looked directly into Jungkook's fragile, shattering eyes. They wanted perfection from your life. A heavy pause. And you wanted perfection from your dream. Jungkook's breathing became uneven. A jagged line on the monitor beneath the machine's control. You ignored every single warning your body gave you. Taeyoung whispered, his own chest tightening. The agonizing pain in your throat. The crushing exhaustion. The weakness in your bones. His eyes darkened with a painful, ancient sorrow. In this world, nothing survives without pain. Silence stretched. Pain is the fuel to life. Jungkook's tears fell faster now, hot against his cold skin. The dark, unyielding reality of time. Inside his mind, his voice cracked again. There is only one life. I have never lived before. His chest rose shakily against the mechanical breath. If all of this is my fault, then what was God's role in my life? Is the divine only there to punish and blame? Taeyoung looked at him silently, maintaining his cold, statue-like posture. But as he began to answer the unspoken questions, his facade slipped. The role was to help you understand your own soul. For us, there is no concept of good or bad. Whatever you do, there is a reaction to your actions. We never blamed you. We never punished you. The machines continued their steady, uncaring beeping beside them. Yes, Taeyoung said quietly, his voice softening for the very first time. He looked down at the boy on the bed. You were inexperienced. You were just learning how to exist. But whenever humans walk blindly toward destruction, life always tries to stop them. Taeyoung glanced briefly at Jungkook's bruised, weakened body. Your body warned you. Nature warned you. Your own pain warned you. A painful, heavy silence followed. But you chose to ignore all of it. His voice nearly broke on the last word. Whether you want to believe it or not, that is the only truth. Jungkook closed his eyes slowly. The room fell into a profound silence once more. Only the hollow sounds of the machines remained alive between them. Taeyoung looked at him quietly for a very long time before speaking one last time. This time, his voice was colder, yet far more fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. Is there anything else? The question hung heavily in the sterile air. It didn't feel like a normal question. It felt like the final question before a permanent goodbye. Jungkook understood immediately. His eyes slowly drifted toward the frosted window beside his ICU bed. Outside, the distant winter lights glowed faintly in the freezing dark. December 30th, the second to last day of the year. A weak, final tear slipped down his cheek. Then, a tiny smile appeared on his chapped lips. Fragile, completely exhausted. It wasn't his old, bright bunny smile. It was just the quiet beauty of acceptance. Inside his mind, his voice whispered with a gentle, peaceful finality. I want to see the New Year fireworks. Taeyoung stared at him, his heart breaking silently in the shadows. Then, he slowly nodded. No arguments. No more lessons. No more pain. Because both of them already understood that the end was here. Jungkook closed his eyes again, letting go of the world, and finally stopped fighting the truth. The ICU corridor smelled of antiseptic and heavy, suffocating silence. It was a quiet, so dense that even the act of breathing felt like a transgression. Hours had bled into one another, yet Jimin remained frozen in the same chair outside the unit, his back pressed hard against the freezing concrete wall, eyes tightly shut, his face swollen and stained a raw, angry red from hours of weeping. Dried tear tracks streaked his cheeks like pale scars across his exhausted skin. The hospital lights cast a sickly, lifeless pallor over the hallway. Then, the sharp echo of footsteps shattered the quiet. Mr. and Mrs. John rushed around the corner. The moment Mrs. John saw the harsh red glow of the ICU sign, her steps stopped dead. She was completely paralyzed. Fear wrapped around her throat like rusted iron chains, cutting off her air. Because right behind that pane of glass lay her son, her baby boy, and she was absolutely terrified to see the broken shell of what remained of him. Her chest tightened with a crushing, agonizing pressure, as if an invisible hammer was striking her heart over and over again. Mr. John forced his trembling legs toward the ICU window. He pressed a shaking palm flat against the cold glass, desperate to peer through the reflection. Machines, a labyrinth of wires, the harsh, metallic rhythm of life being forced artificially into a dying body. And there was Jungkook, utterly motionless, like a beautiful vessel completely abandoned by its soul. Behind them, Jimin slowly opened his swollen eyes, watching the horrific family reunion unfold. He didn't move. He didn't glare. He didn't offer a single word of greeting. There was nothing left inside him, only an endless, hollow emptiness. After several torturous moments, Mr. John finally pulled himself away from the glass. sinking heavily into the chair right beside Jimin. Mrs. John lingered a few feet away, her head bowed, so low she couldn't even bring herself to look. At the door, holding her dying child. Silence returned. A suffocating, merciless vacuum. No one possessed the courage to speak. No one even knew how to formulate a word. Then Jimin shifted. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. He intertwined his fingers so tightly that his knuckles turned ghostly, bloodless, white under the pressure. His head dropped. When he finally forced the words out, his voice was a fragile, scraping whisper. "It's very late." The words cut through the dead air softly, yet they sliced deeper than any scream ever could. He sincerely, desperately waited for you during all those times you were too busy. Jimin lifted his head, forcing them to look at him. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, vibrating with a fierce, restrained agony. And now, his lower lip quivered violently. Even if you tear yourselves apart trying to fix your mistakes, time will never come back. Mr. John's head snapped down, staring at his hands in shameful silence. Jimin turned his gaze back to the ICU door, a bitter, heartbreaking smile cutting through his fresh tears. He loved both of you so much. A heavy tear spilled over his eyelid, tracking down his cheek. He genuinely believed that one day he would prove himself to you, that he would prove he was right, that his dream was worth something. His voice fractured. He bit his lip until it nearly bled, trying to chain down the sob rising in his throat. But the mountain of grief lodged inside his chest refused to stay buried any longer. Mrs. John clamped her trembling hands over her mouth, trying in vain to choke back her violent, ragged sobs. Mr. John stared blankly at the polished floor tiles, a deafening, violent ringing filling his ears. It felt as though the universe itself had gone completely deaf to their misery. Jimin let out a soft laugh, a jagged, broken sound that echoed horribly. Why does everyone always choose pain for him? His tone suddenly warped, trembling with a dark, simmering rage. First, he had to beg you for a single chance to follow his dream. Jimin pointed a shaking finger toward the ICU glass. And now he's in there begging for his literal life. Silence. Why? Why? That question wasn't just meant for the grieving parents anymore. It was a desperate, angry accusation hurled directly at God himself. Jimin finally lost the fragile grip on the calm he had been forcing onto his soul. What horrible sin did he commit to deserve a life like this? His breathing turned chaotic and uneven. If you weren't capable of loving a child, then why the hell did you bring him into this world? Mrs. John's knees gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, weeping uncontrollably at the accusation. But Jimin couldn't stop. The floodgates were wide open. Yes, maybe you were learning how to be parents for the first time with him. His eyes burned with a lethal, tearful fury. But that is not an excuse for the psychological warfare you put him through. His voice exploded, echoing violently down the barren corridor. You had so many dreams for your son, so many toxic expectations for your son. He gestured wildly back toward the door. But did either of you ever stop to think that he had his own dreams, too? The tears streamed down his face in unchecked rivers now. He didn't need perfection from you. Jimin's voice broke completely, reduced to a weeping gasp. He just needed to be loved. A agonizing silence followed his outburst. He was just a little boy. Mrs. John slumped entirely against the wall, her body shaking as memories crashed into her like a physical wave. The very first rapid heartbeat she had heard during an ultrasound. The warmth of the tiny newborn placed against her bare chest. Little Jungkook, his small fingers clinging tightly to her thumb. His very first laugh. His very first tear. His very first unprompted word, Mom. And every single subsequent moment where she had chosen cold discipline and silence over an understanding hug. Jimin looked down at her with completely shattered eyes. He was always so terrified of being left alone. Her sobbing intensified, turning into a desperate wail. He hated sleeping in the dark alone. He hated eating by himself. Jimin swallowed hard, the lump in his throat tasting like iron. He just wanted to sleep beside you. He wanted to share meals with you. He wanted to play with you, to explore the world holding your hands. His expression hardened into pure ice. But what did you give him instead? Discipline, perfection, vicious words that no innocent child should ever have. To hear from the people who created him. Mr. John clenched his fists so hard his nails bit into his palms. Every single cruel sentence, every cold dismissal he had ever thrown at Jungkook and now flew back through his memory like sharp knives, stabbing him in the chest. The only absolute comfort he ever found was in his music. Jimin let out a weak, breathless smile. It understood his soul better than his own blood ever did. His eyes slowly closed as his own memories took over. Jungkook's beautiful, bright bunny smile. Their silly, playful arguments in his room. The endless, exhausting hours Jungkook spent practicing. The horrific day his body finally collapsed. The agonizing, slow-motion destruction of a beautiful boy's body and soul. Jimin opened his eyes, glaring at the broken parents. Did you ever truly take the time to look at his smile? No answer. Did you ever notice the ocean of pain he was hiding right behind it? Nothing but the sound of weeping. Jimin laughed bitterly, wiping his face. Never. Right? His voice dropped, turning deadly cold. Because both of you failed completely as parents. The words struck harder than physical slaps to the face. Your goddamn egos mattered more than your own blood. Mr. John trembled violently, unable to speak a single word of defense. So tell me, Jimin suddenly bolted upright, his chair screeching against the floor. Where is that ego now? Answer me. Why are both of you silent? His breathing turned shallow and erratic. If you had just changed earlier, we would never be sitting here today. Before he could say anything further, Suga rushed forward, throwing his arms around him and pulling him back. Jimin, stop. Stop. Let me go. Jimin screamed, struggling frantically against the hold. I want to know. I need them to tell me. Where have they been all this time? Did they ever even look back at him after he got sick? Then he froze. Standing at the very end of the corridor was V. His face was entirely bloodless. His eyes were swollen and red, his soul visibly shattered. Jimin's anger evaporated into pure heartbreak. V approached Jimin, his legs shaking beneath him, his chest tightening so hard he could barely draw breath. Jimin stood completely frozen. When they finally stood face to face, their eyes locked. Jimin immediately lowered his head, crushed by the suffocating guilt of failing to save Jungkook's life. With trembling hands, V slowly reached out and grabbed the collar of Jimin's shirt. His grip was weak, shaking violently. When V spoke, his voice was nothing but a fragile whisper, cracking under the weight of his grief. Why didn't you tell me? He swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears. I trusted you. I believed you would take good care of him. A heavy, suffocating pause followed. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to speak. Jimin wept harder, each word striking him like a physical slap to the face. Tell me, Jimin. V's voice broke completely. Why did you hide this from me? Suddenly, V shook Jimin violently by his collar before pulling him forward into a desperate, crushing hug. Within seconds, Jimin wrapped his arms around V, holding him back just as tightly. Locked in each other's arms, both of them completely burst into tears, letting their shared agony shatter the silence of the corridor. I'm sorry, Jimin sobbed uncontrollably into V's shoulder. I couldn't keep our promise. Jean approached quickly, his voice shaking with worry. Jimin, V, Jean, and RM gently separated them, while J-Hope guided V toward a chair. V sat there, looking completely like a ghost. J-Hope gently placed a warm, grounding hand on his shoulder. V slowly turned his head to look at him. His eyes were bloodshot, and his lips trembled. I was too late, wasn't I, Hyung? His voice was a mere whisper in the quiet. I followed him like his shadow, but I forgot that shadows disappear when darkness falls. That sentence shattered J-Hope completely. He pulled V into a tight hug, his own eyes filling with tears. V had loved Jungkook for years, long before he even understood what the word meant. He had been the first to notice Jungkook's quiet brilliance, protecting him from the sidelines. Even after transferring schools when his family faced a devastating financial collapse, V had carried only one dream through the wreckage of his own life: to rebuild himself and stand proudly beside Jungkook one day. And Jimin had known. That was why they had made a sacred promise to each other. Until Jungkook was finally safe in V's arms, they would protect him together. But now, that promise lay dead on the ICU floor. Inside the room, Jungkook lay motionless beneath the harsh, sterile white lights. The ventilator rhythmically forced air into his chest. The heart monitor beeped, tracing a steady line of life. In the suffocating quiet of the ICU corridor, Kim V stood frozen before the glass door, his hollow gaze fixed on the boy inside. Beside him stood J-Hope and RM, their hands resting heavily on his shoulders, serving as the only anchors keeping him from collapsing entirely. Further down the hallway, Jimin and Suga sat on the vinyl chairs, their bodies drained of all strength. Behind the closed doors, Jin remained inside with Jungkook's doctor, desperately discussing a condition that felt increasingly hopeless. On another row of chairs, Mr. and Mrs. John clung to each other like shipwreck survivors. Mrs. John leaned her heavy, tear-soaked head onto her husband's shoulder, her soft whimpers cutting through the silence. Mr. John leaned his head back against the cold wall, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as the crushing weight of reality finally settled in. The ICU corridor held nothing anymore, except the heavy ashes of truth, regret, and a love that had arrived far too late. The rooftop of the hospital stood above the sleeping city like the edge of another world. It was the final night of the year. Down below, the streets shimmered with lights and restless excitement. People gathered with hopeful hearts, waiting for midnight to arrive. A new year, new dreams, new beginnings. But on the rooftop, time stood frozen. Only two souls remained. Taeyoung and Jungkook stood barely a hand's breadth apart, silent beneath the winter sky. The biting wind passed between them like an invisible wall, making nature itself the only witness to their final moment. Jungkook looked over the winding roads, the glowing hospital windows, and the tiny, moving cars below. Everything felt strangely distant, like lightning flashing for a single second before vanishing into the dark forever. A faint, fragile smile touched Jungkook's lips. Taeyoung smiled too, but it was a smile that hid a sadness no human eye could ever see. Jungkook finally spoke, his voice carrying softly against the wind. "Can everyone see their soul guardian?" He turned slowly. Their eyes met. For a single heartbeat, the rest of the world completely disappeared. Taeyoung did not answer, breaking the eye contact first. He looked up toward the empty night sky, dark and endless above them. Jungkook swallowed hard, the silence heavy between them. "Did you ever have feelings?" Taeyoung looked back at him. This time, something unreadable mirrored deep inside his eyes. Something ancient, painful, a profound sorrow that Jungkook could never fully understand. "Probably not." Taeyoung answered, his tone deliberately cold. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. Only the distant, muffled sounds of the celebration below remained alive beneath them. Jungkook felt a sharp, twisting ache inside his chest. Downstairs, his physical body still lay on a ventilator. He could still hear the faint, echoing voices of doctors. He could feel the desperate touches of people holding onto his hands while he slowly slipped away into the dark, his eyes shut tightly against the reality. When he opened them again, they were rimmed with red, his cheeks flushed pink from the sheer effort of holding back his tears. "Can I get a second chance?" he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his despair. Taeyoung stared at him, motionless. He said nothing, but his own dark eyes had already begun to drown in unshed tears. Jungkook forced a smile through the agonizing pain. Taeyoung finally spoke, his voice trembling. "It was your chance to meet your loved ones one last time, if you wanted." Before he could even finish the sentence, "No." Jungkook's voice came out as a broken whisper. I don't want their grieving faces to be my last memory. The wind grew colder, howling around them. Taeyoung's expression remained an unreadable mask of grief. Are you sure? Jungkook nodded slowly. Even if this is my law. He stopped himself, unable to say the word last. Taeyoung looked at him sharply, but Jungkook ignored his piercing gaze. Far below them, the city suddenly erupted into a roar of noise. The countdown had begun. 10. Jungkook's heartbeat quickened violently. 9. Something heavy and suffocating pressed against his chest. 8. His throat tightened, choking on words he would never get to say. 7. He no longer felt the agonizing physical pain of the cancer. 6. But this psychological numbness was so much worse. 5. The terrifying, absolute understanding that this was truly the end. 4. He was leaving everything behind forever. 3. The beautiful world, his unfulfilled dreams and wishes, the people he cherished. 2. Faces flashed through his mind in a rapid, heartbreaking blur. Jimin, Jin, RM, Suga, J-Hope, his entire band, his bandmates, the devoted fans who adored him, his parents, his teachers, the random strangers who had once smiled his way, and his dear Ajuma. 1. The sky exploded with fireworks. For a fraction of a second, Jungkook stood entirely still, his eyes slowly opening as he bathed in the golden light. Below, the city screamed in pure happiness. But he never once looked at the display dancing across the sky. Instead, through a blur of trembling tears, a soft, painful laugh escaped his lips. Then, without a single warning, he lunged forward and threw himself into Taeyoung's arms. It happened too fast. Even a cosmic entity like Taeyoung could not read his thoughts this time. Jungkook buried his face deep into the crook of Taeyoung's neck, inhaling the void of dark, freezing cold, and shut his eyes tightly. For the very first time, he felt cold. Not a painful cold, not a lonely cold, just a deep, endless numbness, like being gently pulled into a quiet whirlpool beneath a vast ocean. And somehow it felt peaceful. Then, suddenly, his spiritual body gave out. Jungkook collapsed weakly against Taeyoung's chest. The fierce hug loosened. Taeyoung looked down at him. He looked at the tears still clinging to Jungkook's pale cheeks. He looked at the faint, serene smile frozen on his lips. And for the very first time in his eternal existence, Taeyoung tried to cry. But tears were impossible for a being like him. The phantom pain in his chest tightened more and more, suffocating his ancient soul. He pulled Jungkook's limp body tightly against him. Then he roared. It was a sound so broken, so furious, and so utterly devastated that even the night sky seemed to tremble. Because Jungkook was never supposed to matter. He was only supposed to be an assignment, a duty. But he wasn't just a soul guardian anymore. Because Taeyoung had broken every sacred rule, every limit, every boundary between death and human feeling. Why did you touch me? He screamed into the empty air, his voice shattering into raw sobs. I would have fulfilled your second wish. Why were you in such a hurry? In that tragic embrace, his first cold, immortal touch met Jungkook's last warm, mortal breath. Taeyoung lowered his gaze slowly. Jungkook was already beginning to fade, still holding the vanishing boy close. Taeyoung leaned down slowly and pressed a trembling, desperate kiss against his forehead. Little by little, Jungkook's beautiful existence dissolved into particles of light against the darkness. And then, Taeyoung returned to his true form, an endless emptiness. He became a dark, hollow existence where nothing could be seen and nothing could be felt. A lonely dimension where even tears were strictly forbidden. The fireworks continued to explode across the vibrant sky. The world welcomed a new year with boundless joy. While on the lonely rooftop above the celebrating city, one beautiful soul disappeared into peace forever, and another was left behind in eternal, weeping coldness. Below, inside the ICU corridor, a soul stood burdened by the pain, carrying a silent, one-sided love that he could never confess.